Okay, good evening, everybody, wherever you are, and welcome to this presentation, which is going to introduce you to some of the history and narratives and themes relating to the Hand of Glory or severed hands in general. So, in the past, I've worked with other scholars in a Wellcome Trust project looking at the power of criminal corpses. And one of our central questions was, what makes one body different from another body? What makes a body notorious? What makes a body sacred? So we'll be familiar with notorious bodies, major criminals, serial killers, so forth, and so-called sacred bodies such as saints or even celebrities. And one of the key questions we had is what is the difference in terms of power? Why are we drawn to these body parts? Why are we drawn to these relics? What is the difference between a t-shirt and a t-shirt that Elvis wore? Like, what is the essential difference? Is it some sort of power, allure, aura? Is it something we're giving a nondescript item? Or is there something in the sweat and blood of Elvis that that gives that normal t-shirt potency? So today I'm going to riff off that broad theme and talk a bit more about severed hands. So I'll introduce the topic by talking about a story which emerged in 1872 in a newspaper, and it was a story by a woman called Old Jenny, and she recalled telling some children a story of her youth when she was just a girl. And it related to the execution of a highwayman called Henry Clark, who was hung in chains or gibbeted near Chester in 1791. And sometime later, one of the hands of this hanged man disappeared from the gibbet, only to reappear under strange circumstances. So one night, a traveller was passing by the door of a farmer's house close to where Jenny worked, and this traveller was granted permission to leave a box there during the night. And that night, a maidservant working in the house started to feel unwell, and being unable to sleep, she went downstairs for a glass of water. And to her surprise and terror, she saw a tall man noiselessly engaged in removing a brown and withered human hand from a box which was smeared with ointment, and he then set the hand alight. Soon the thumb and fingers were burning with a strange blue flame, all except one. And as the man ransacked the house, the girl tried to rouse the other inhabitants in vain, and the farmer was himself in a deep sleep. So at the end of her tether, she eventually found a jug of milk, and the hand was burning on a table, and she poured the milk over the lit hand, and it extinguished the flames. Everyone woke up, and the thief fled into the night. So this story that Old Jenny told the children, which was reprinted in 1872, this is a variant of a well-known folk tale which circulates widely throughout the 19th century in Ireland, Britain, and France. And it's the tale of how the magical hand of glory was used in the attempted robbery of a rural dwelling at night. Many of the core features of Jenny's tale, such as the narcotic power of the hand, the ability of the hand to locate treasure or riches, and the bravery of the wakeful servant who was the one person who didn't fall asleep. These are motifs which recur in several other variants of this tale. But many of these elements go right back into the medieval period. And indeed, we can trace some of the elements back to a Latin text from the 13th century. And this is a story by a chronicler called Caesarius of Heisterbach. And he was a collector of miracle stories. And he tells the story of how one night in Germany, a blind man named Engelbert was staying in a hostel, and he awoke to some strange noises, and he sensed that two thieves were ransacking the house. He was unable to wake the other inhabitants and wake the servants. So instead he grabbed a club or a stick and he attacked the thieves, guided by their voices, it said, and he struck them and drove them from the home. And it said, in the morning, Engelbert gave information of the theft, but none of his neighbors sleeping near could be awakened by any means. The search was made for signs of witchcraft, for they knew that this must have happened by some such power, and they found above the door, hanging from the roof, what looked like the backbone of a human corpse. When this was taken away, all at once awoke. So this is actually a story which also reappears on the other side of the Atlantic in the New World, because in the early 17th century, a Franciscan missionary called Juan de Torquemada collects this story from the indigenous people of central Mexico. And he's talking about a gang of nocturnal thieves who worship a pagan god, as he says, and they number 15 to 20, and they roam around robbing houses. But this particular element of the story stands out, that this gang carry the arm of a woman who had died during her first childbirth, and it's carried before entering the house where they're going to carry out a robbery. And with this, they say, everyone inside would fall asleep or faint, and none of them could talk or move from the place where they were lying asleep, and those who were awake were left stunned and frightened, and even if they wanted to and saw the danger, they were unable to do anything. So two stories which are quite frightening about the narcotic nature of these severed limbs, which seem to cause everyone to fall asleep into some sort of a deep paralysis. And again, a very different tradition where this theme is popping up. So what was this hand of glory, and why have people been telling stories about this for such a long time? So the hand of glory is essentially the severed hand of a hanged man. It's haven't come across any cases of it being a hanged woman, which is interesting, perhaps. And it's thought to be a magical object which gives its possessor certain abilities. Ironically, the ability to commit further crime, perhaps continuing the criminal career of its previous owner. And it's well known as a demonic object in the early modern period, especially in the era of witchcraft prosecutions. But it does form part of a wider set of Northern European folk beliefs about magical hands, about healing hands, about dangerous hands, which in many cases involve ordinary people using these icons or these body parts in thefts, magic, and counter magic. And it was believed that if the hand was treated or pickled or mummified or dried out in some way, it could be transformed into a torch or a candle, and it would put people to sleep at night so that people could burgle homes as they saw fit. And in the sources we have, there's two main ways that this hand of glory could become a candle. So the image on the left is from a grimoire, and it shows how this hand of glory is simply a closed fist with some form of wax inserted, and the candle is then stuck onto the hand, and it presumably takes on the qualities of the severed hand. Other iterations of the hand of glory describe wicks emerging from the fingertips, and thereby each finger being lit in a way. And the image on the right is from the only real surviving hand of glory that's in Whitby Museum, which is a great place to go. So it's got all of these attractive powers. It seems to be a kind of a magical icon of wealth and power to lots of people. And although stories of the hand of glory start to circulate in Northern Europe in the medieval period, they form part of a much wider set of cultural beliefs around corpses, and particularly around criminal corpses. And these are quite difficult to anchor in any one place or period. But I think it's probably the best example of the wider idea that notorious bodies give off power and give off aura and charisma in a way. And we try to harness that charisma either by collecting, curating the body parts of notorious people, or destroying them utterly. I know earlier this morning we had a brief discussion about modern notorious criminals, such as Osama bin Laden, who have had their body disappeared precisely because of this mystique around the dead, the notorious dead. But you can also extend that idea to the buildings and the tools and the clothing of these people. So a couple of years ago, the BBC reported on how the very home in which the Soham killer lived was demolished because no one would live there, and it had zero value. But it's bricks and mortar. It's a house, but of course it's so much more than a house. It becomes part of that criminal identity. So I think we can all get the idea that we can all sense power or darkness in things. It may not be a magical belief. It might just simply be a kind of an instinctual sense that a person's identity goes beyond their skin. It goes into other things, including objects. So scholars and folklorists are generally familiar with 19th century tales like the tale of Old Jenny, which I introduced the talk with. So today I'm going to go over some of the origin stories of this Hand of Glory and try to figure out how it was that this folk motif came to be linked to criminals hanging at the gallows. So the origins of the Hand of Glory can, I think, be traced back to long-term associations between the mandrake plant and the corpse of the hanged man. And wherever they've grown, mandrakes have been considered magical and mysterious plants with lots of amazing powers. And part of their allure comes from the fact that they resemble or can be made to resemble humans with their limbs and their digits and toes, and even beards and long hair. So this kind of anthropomorphic sense of plant is quite important in the legend of the mandrake. And mandrake legends exist all over the globe, relating to fertility magic, to protection, to love charms, and of course to medicine and surgery, where mandrakes are used as soporifics and painkillers, and they frequently pop up in Shakespeare in all of those guises as love charms and as narcotics. They appear in Hebrew folklore, especially relating to the story of Rachel, who was apparently barren, but miraculously gave birth following her interaction with love apples, which are interpreted as mandrakes. And we've also got some early stories about the danger of gathering mandrakes, and there's lots of rituals about how one should go about collecting such a dangerous plant. Indeed, one English traveller in the 17th century, Henry Maundrell, in 1697, he noted that mandrakes were still being used in Palestine for fertility magic. He said they were placed under the pillow or under the bed of women at night who wanted to conceive. According to James Fraser, the great folklorist, he discusses mandrakes as being infallible love charms, which can make the owner invulnerable or invisible. But they all have this one thing in common, which is that they can reveal treasures hidden under the earth. So the mandrake is linked to generation, to life, to healing, but also to power, potentially criminal power. So with all of these associations, it's no great surprise that that the mandrake becomes part of the supernatural or the magical universe in the ancient period. And one influential account by Flavius Josephus suggests that human secretion is needed to uproot this plant properly. Josephus also talks about how it emits a light, and that the sacrifice of a life is the price of its discovery. And this is what you're seeing in this image on the left. This is a representation of the traditional story of how one should uproot a mandrake. And instead of just going out and pulling it, what you needed to do was tie a dog to the root and entice the dog away with some treats. And then when the dog pulled the mandrake out, the mandrake would emit a shriek, a horrific shriek. And on hearing this, the dog would drop down dead, but the human would be fine. So that's why you've in contemporary vernacular, you've got reference to the mandrake shriek. And I remember once coming across this in Parliament, in a parliamentary record in the 19th century, where an Irish politician was talking for a long time, and somebody eventually asked him to stop his mandrake shriek. It was so bad. So this is a representation of that ritual, that the mandrake is alive, and if it is uprooted, it needs to take a life. So there's a transference going on there. So the dog takes the hit in this story. So interestingly, by the 16th century, this ritual of growth and uprooting has changed slightly in Europe. And by this time, to link it to Josephus, people are talking about the secretions of the hanged man as being crucial to the growth of this plant. So this is where we've got this link between the semen of the executed man and the strange flowers which grow beneath the gallows. So to delve into this link a little bit more, we need to look at two different strands of folklore, one coming from the East and one coming from Northern Europe. And the first set of connections between the mandrake and the gallows may have originally come from the ancient Greek legend of Prometheus, who is punished for the theft of fire by being chained to a rock. And as his innards are pecked away for eternity, a strange flower grows from his gore or his guts. And this strange flower was known as the herb of Prometheus, and it had certain magical qualities. Now, crusaders returning to Europe from the Near East may have brought traditions of these magical flowers which grow from the executed god with them, and they may have overlapped with mandrake legends and other magical plant legends, suggesting that something powerful comes from secretions, comes from urine, from blood, from semen, whatever, especially if that person is divine or, as we might say, notorious or infamous. Given the physiological consequences of execution by hanging, we do know that hanging would lead to a lot of involuntary secretions, not only semen on occasions, but everything else really. So you can imagine an execution site is quite wet and gore-filled, and you can imagine that people will be quite interested into the what might come underneath the gallows side, what might grow from this collection of fluids. So the popular legend, of course, is that the mandrake, which is a human-like plant, grows from this fertilized ground where the secretions of the dangerous dead have created a new kind of life force, and that their power hasn't just disappeared into the air. It's gone into something else, something dangerous. And the link between the gallows and the mandrake in Northern European mythology, meanwhile, comes from a relationship between the mandrake, which is called Alraun in North Germanic languages, and runic magic in the myth of the old Norse god Odin. And Odin is said to have hung himself from a tree and ejaculated in an act of self-sacrifice, which led to his knowledge of the runes. This is also seen as a symbolic rebirth. And I'm sure many of you, of course, will see allusions to Jesus as well, coming at a different time period, who, of course, is an ever-present idea on the gallows for most executed people, either in the form of prayers that they're uttering, or in terms of a comparison, about the divine criminal or the executed god. So in Northern European legends, these special runes could be carved on roots or pieces of wood, and they became known as alruna, and were linked to fertility and magic, just like the mandrake. So we can look to the mandrake legends for details of the Hand of Glory. We can see that the mandrake and the Hand of Glory share certain properties, such as their flame, their narcotic power, their ability to burgle houses and put people to sleep. And the overlap between the Hand of Glory and the mandrake really starts to occur in the 15th century, when there's a market for mandrake mannequins. And there's some images of these on the left. And these kind of talismans or icons circulate throughout Europe, and we have some reports of them in England as well, in early modern England, but they're generally seen as counterfeits. It's just a different type of a root that's been carved to look like kind of a wizened human. And around this time as well, there is quite an interesting linguistic glossing going on, where the mandrake, mandragoire, is overlapping with a new description, the main de gloire, the Hand of Glory, in French around this time. So there's connections in terms of the themes and the shared properties, but also there's a very strong linguistic connection. So when do people start carrying around these severed hands in a way that they carried around mandrake roots, or use mandrake roots? And to answer this, we should think about why hands matter to people. Why is this such an important body part? Why is it such an important part of our identity? So hands are obviously essential to communicate with others. They give us the ability to perform complicated acts of labor. They give us the ability to heal, thinking of surgery and medicine. There would be kingly power invested in hands and in the power of hands as well. We can think of the whole history of gesture and so forth. Hands are also essential in defensive maneuvers for humans, and also in inflicting violence on others. But hands are also containers of our personality and our soul, and not least in the modern science of fingerprints. But people have believed this for a very long time before fingerprints, that the hand is probably, after the face, the closest part of our body to a sense of self. And that's why there's something different about carrying around a severed hand than carrying around a kneecap, or even something like an ear or something. Although I'm open to debate about that. So hands have been used in medicine, in divination, in healing, in religious cultures. We speak about the hand of marriage, the hand of justice, and it's a part. Hands are a deep part of our sense of how our bodies act in society. There's also a huge archaeology and tangible heritage of representations of the hand, not least in the Mano and Fika traditions throughout Europe, where hands are used as protective amulets, and also as objects of fertility, which I think is quite interesting. There's a phallic element in these collections. And also there was a great tradition of dumping votive hands in various rivers throughout Roman culture. But when a hand is severed from a body, how do we think of a hand then? Does the hand become a dead hand, or does it become something new? What happens to the agency and the power in a severed hand? Why should people want the body part of a dead person? What is it that's giving them that desire? So you might say that there's a certain uncanny status to a severed hand. If you think of the body as a whole, and the body as a container, and that is legible and logical, the loss of a hand affects the coherence of the body as a whole. But as I said earlier, the hand is so invested with meaning, and it's overloaded with all of these associations in language and in psychology, that you can imagine it's seen as a part of us, only separate. It's part of our personality. It may even have its own mind and its own way of doing things. So if we look at folklore and literature and cinema, especially modern cinema, dead hands are quite lively objects that do tap into this idea of being possessed or having a mind of their own, and this is to go back to the gallows again. This taps into this idea that even as the criminal is hanged and executed, their hands contained power even before they were severed. So you've got lots of stories, and my colleagues Owen Davies and Francesco Mattioni have written. I've written a whole book on this, actually, called Executing Magic, which is available free to download. And in this book, they talk about how execution sites were sites of death, but also sites of healing, where people would gather under the gallows, and they would put children on their shoulders and give them a G up so that they could touch the hand of the dead felon. And criminals were thought to be particularly good at healing skin conditions, tumors and wens, especially wens in the neck, which is quite interesting. And this then goes back to that story I talked about at the start, about how do we distinguish between sacred and profane? How do we distinguish between a notorious death and a sacred power? And the interesting thing is that what the dead criminals are doing is quite similar to what a lot of European monarchs are doing around the same time. So we have all these stories of the Stuarts, especially in England, in Britain, who are performing the royal touch on sick people, and people are particularly coming to the king with skin conditions such as scrofula, and tumors and things like this. And I suppose modern skeptics might say that these conditions are quite variable, and wens can grow and descend in size, based around massage or based around touch, and there might be some psychosomatic connections between skin conditions or even seasonal conditions. So you can imagine that people may have seen visual evidence of miracles being performed when a king or a criminal touched a tumor or a wen. But again, interesting to see the same essential practice being performed by two people at opposite ends of a spectrum of one utterly disrespectful, illegitimate, asocial, one central to sovereignty and to authority in society. So, although they're traditionally associated with the pharmacopoeia of witches, and many ordinary people wanted severed hands, and in general wanted bits of criminals. So here we have a wonderful etching from Goya called "Out Hunting for Teeth," criminals were basically sliced and diced during this period in early modern Europe. And a great source for these stories is the diary of Franz Schmidt, who is a particularly brutal but also quite intelligent and literate hangman in Nuremberg in the late 16th century. And Schmidt talks about how nails and rope and clothing and body parts of criminals were part of a marketplace, a magical marketplace, and that they were in open circulation during this period, not just in witchcraft prosecutions, but in the everyday folk medicine and magic of ordinary people. And to make it another link then between the gallows as a site of death and the gallows as a site of life, we can again go back to the Middle East, to another traveler called Giovanni Carreri, who's going around the same time as Henry Mondrell goes to Palestine, and he finds this wonderful story of barren Persian women who go under the gallows while criminals or malefactors are hanging, and they imagine the dead body can infuse fruitfulness into the womb and can make them breed children. So a very interesting connection there to rebirth and to life at this symbolic side of death. And this probably all comes back to this essential idea that power has to go somewhere, even dark criminal power. It can't dissipate, it must find a grounding somewhere, and people want to harness this power in some form. So because of their connections with healing and good luck, and because of their association with Mandrake, the hands of these hanged men became prized by thieves, of course, as charms and as tools of the trade, so to speak. And these stories of hands being used in burglaries pops up quite a lot in Germanic territories. And we've got lots of stories of thieves using the fingers of hanged people, but also wealthy people and merchants using thieves' fingers as counter magic to protect their homes from burglary. So in going right back to the 15th century, in 1411, in Hans Vintler's poem, The Flowers of Virtue, it's stated that thieves used the hand of a hanged man to make themselves invisible. And we've also got quite an early case in England from 1440, where there was a plot uncovered to try and poison the king, Henry VI. And one of the plotters apparently kept a dead man's arm in which a candle was placed as part of the plot. And he said that with such an arm, they that sleep shall sleep, and they that wake shall not move. And this link between the mandrake and the severed hand is really made explicit around 1475, when a priest in the Vendée region in France talks about a witch who was burnt at the stake, and she had a dead hand around her neck at the stake. And the priest, called Jean Vincent, said she kept people asleep by making the reverse sign of the cross with this hand. And it's not surprising that such things can happen by means of a demon's device, because physicians do something similar when they give a person a drink of mandrake root mixed in wine. This drink puts patients into such a deep sleep that they don't notice the pain of incision at all. So witches are these people who have amazing pharmaceutical powers to poison and to put people to sleep using herbs such as mandrake and belladonna, but they also have these hands which gives them a certain added power. And during the era of continental witchcraft prosecutions, the Hand of Glory pops up quite frequently in inquisitorial accounts and in demonological tracts, and it's essentially used as a slander on people who are being investigated. And it pops up in some of the wonderful art relating to witchcraft during this period, where it's an ever-present icon on the back of a painting, usually on the mantelpiece, with its ghostly light. So with this publicity and this association between witches and the Hand of Glory, and there's an upsurge in criminal cases relating to this. And we've got stories right across the German-speaking territories, especially. There's a story in Lithuania in 1619 where a man is burnt after admitting under torture that he murdered several infants in order to gather their sinews to create the wicks for his Hands of Glory. We've also got a story from John Aubrey in the 17th century, who talks about how criminals before the civil wars in England would rob houses using the severed hand of a hanged man. And slightly later, as we approach the 18th century, the Hand of Glory features in a famous scandal that rocked Paris, rocked the aristocracy during the reign of Louis XIV. And this was the affair of the poisons, where there was a royal investigation into a series of alleged poisonings or plots to poison, apparently led by a sorceress called Catherine Moine-Vazon. And in her confession, she revealed a criminal, magical underworld of fortune telling and love magic, and abortions and malefica and necromantic practices. But she also talks about the manufacture and sale of a Hand of Glory for an enormous sum of money, which she gained selling it to a aristocrat. And by this stage, the Hand of Glory is an ever-present in the grimoires of the 18th century, particularly the Petit Albert in I think one of the earliest, if not the earliest, editions of 1704. And we've got a recipe for the Hand of Glory there, which is maybe worth trying out sometime if anybody happens to have a hand available. And the recipe there talks about drying the hand out once you've taken it off the gallows, and squeezing it dry, and then putting it into an earthenware vessel with some different herbs and peppers and salt and nitre, and leaving it in the vessel for a fortnight, and then letting it dry out in the sunlight during the dog days, until it becomes quite dry. Then you can make your candle taking the fat of the executed felon and mixing the fat with some virgin wax and sesame. And then you would use the hand as essentially the candlestick to hold this, this magical fat candle. And with this baneful instrument, everyone in the place you shall enter shall remain motionless, according to the magical recipe. So in France, you've got this tradition in grimoires and in this story of the plot to poison the king, that the hand of glory is linked to treasure and linked to magic. But to go back to Franz Schmidt, the executioner in Nuremberg, in Germany, you've got a lot more disturbing stories of people who are murdering children and pregnant women to get access to the hands of children and unborn children, to use them in their magic and create these thieves' candles, as they're called in Germany, Diebslicht, thieves' lights. And there's several cases of child murder on record in the early modern period, but also right into the 19th century. You've got some quite horrific stories there around thieves' candles and fetal hearts as well. So, you know, long after the era of witchcraft prosecutions, you've still got these connections in folklore or folk crime relating to hands. And interestingly, in 1888, an Austrian rabbi in London made a link between the Whitechapel killer and this practice of killing people to use their fat to create thieves' lights. So there's a suggestion there that Jack the Ripper was someone who was part of this long and gruesome tradition of killing people for their to turn them into lights, essentially. So, although it's part of folklore and it's part of tradition, it's not until the 19th century that the hand of glory really enters the newspaper press and is reported a lot. And I think this is because by the time of modern journalism and increased literacy, editors love these stories because it's a way of distinguishing urban and rural. It's a way of distinguishing peasants from the enlightened, and it's a way of poking fun at the superstitions of the past and separating out the uneducated from the educated. So we get lots of these stories popping up in the press in these kind of patronizing descriptions where people's beliefs in severed hands are seen as kind of ridiculous and laughable. And we've a few famous cases in Ireland. In 1831, some thieves are caught red-handed with a severed hand. They're trying to burgle a house, and it happens again in 1850. And then in 1863, a man is prosecuted for beating up his wife because she has hidden his talisman, which was a dead man's finger. And she's hidden it because she believes he's a bad man and he's performing crimes. So she hides it in the field, buries it in the field, and then forgets where it is. And the press then talks about this case, and it pops up in the Times in London, where it's said that when she subsequently forgot exactly where she buried her husband's dead man's finger, then she felt the power of her husband's 5 fingers in a very unmanly way. So he is prosecuted for that offence. Meanwhile, in Ireland, again, traditional folklore talks about how witches would use severed hands or severed fingers to corrupt the butter of their neighbours, which is a traditional folk crime. And again, just like other folk customs, such as ghost belief and fairy belief, there's a sense of a concept of superstition emerging, where these people are superstitious and On the one hand, we collect their stories and put them into folklore journals. On the other hand, we scoff at them in the press because they're nonsensical. So it's good for historians because we get access to these cases, but also a bit tricky because they're quite problematic, and their meaning is sometimes occluded. So I'll start to come to a conclusion, and I'll talk a little bit about literature before I end. And there's some really fantastic stories out there which take this long tradition of severed hands and bring them into the supernatural and horror fiction of the 19th century, this golden era. And we've got some fantastic stories involving hands by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu and Gérard de Nerval in France, and Guy de Maupassant and Theodore Dreiser in Germany, and a whole lot of pulp fiction from less well-known authors. And in many cases, they're tapping into this folkloric tradition of the severed hand having this animate power, but also maybe more modern concepts of the hand as a danger to its owner, and the hand as a weapon of self-destruction and self-harm, which is quite interesting. And this links to then growing work in psychiatry about phantom limbs in the late 19th century, where philosophers and physicians and indeed psychical researchers are interested in what happens when a person loses a limb. So on the one hand, you've got a whole tradition where people keep their severed limbs, and many people in the American Civil War and other wars maintain an attachment to a separated body part, and even give them its own grave. But on the other hand, you've got lots of people reporting continuing sensations of body parts, even though they're gone. So people continue to feel their hands or their legs, even though they're gone, suggesting that there is a kind of a sense of a whole body that we can never really sever. And of course, writers and authors love this theme because it gives them inspiration to talk about the way that these severed hands maintain their agency and their animacy. So we've got a real outpouring in dead hand horror in the 20th century, which is quite interesting. And this seeps into cinema as well. And we've got a couple of good horror movies involving dead hands, and The Hands of Orlac, The Beast with Five Fingers, of course. Everyone will know the Addams Family, but my favorite will be this one in the middle, Mad Love, which is from 1935, and I think is available on archive.org, or it used to be available there to watch free of charge, possibly on YouTube as well. And this is a story in which a man has his hands crushed in a train accident, and he goes to a surgeon for help, and the surgeon is pioneering an experimental hand transplant, a procedure, double hand transplant, which he will do for free. Unfortunately, the hands he is using are the hands of a notorious killer who has just been guillotined in Paris. And this criminal was a maniac who had a real set of skills with knives. And he then transplants these hands onto the poor chap who had the accident, and this sets in motion a whole adventure involving these hands taking over the life of the poor chap. So that's worth checking out. And I'll bring this to a conclusion now and take any questions you have. But I'll leave you with this image of the Wicker Man, where we have this tradition that links putting someone to sleep, but also, if everybody knows the Wicker Man, a sense of fertility crisis and folk magic as well. And as I mentioned before, hands are maybe quite a strong example in this broader idea that the body parts of certain people have agency and have power and draw us to them. And there will be many religious contexts in which severed hands or fingers have a sacred or religious power. I know in England there's a hand of Father Arrowsmith, who's a Jesuit priest in the early modern period. I'm not sure if it's still on display, but you'll see whenever we can all travel again and go to shrines and cathedrals and whatnot, there'll be body parts and thigh bones and ears and God knows what of sacred people. So the question then is, what kind of power is involved here? Is this something that is imagined and is part of the creative imagination, or is it linked to this essential idea that such a piece of our body cannot just be a lump of flesh once it's severed from us? It must have some of us still in it, or it must have some of the criminal still in it, and that might be some kind of an essential idea in many societies. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully I haven't made you ill with these themes and discussions. Okay.
Thank you.